Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're on this channel for the first time, then I'll give you a very brief interlude. What we do on this channel, we talk about Jungian psychoanalysis, mostly Jungian psychoanalysis, psychology, neuroscience, and sort of attempt to develop perspectives on individual behavior and the question how to sort of conduct ourselves in the interaction or on the intersection with a reality that is quite enigmatic and which we don't know that much about, right? Now, in this video, we'll talk about the three common misunderstandings in Jungian psychoanalysis. So this will be a video particularly on Carl Jung, Swiss psychoanalyst who wrote about around the turn of the 20th century, who was a student of Sigmund Freud, who invented basically the technique of psychoanalysis and diverted from Freud in his career for multiple reasons and went on to develop his own theories. And his theories have been popularized, especially lately by thinkers like Jordan Peterson, who have co-opted, I would say, Jungian concepts and developed them into something that may easily be misunderstood for those who are sort of new to the Jungian field and haven't read Jung. So here are three common misunderstandings in Jungian psychoanalysis from my own perspective. And I do say that I always go a little bit beyond Jung in my interpretations and try to really closely read him. I've studied Jung for over a decade and, more than a decade, far more, almost 2 decades. And we'll now try to sort of go into these three most common misunderstandings very concisely, so that I'll try to make this under 10 minutes. If you like this video, give me a like and do consider to subscribe to the channel, because we are sharing a lot of very important and interesting videos on Carl Jung and adjacent topics as I introduced. So, 3 concepts. 1, the collective unconscious and the idea that we can see it. 2, the self can be realized. 3, we can control reality or our reality and our development. And then a bonus, and I'll just very briefly tease this, at the end of the video, the question or the fact that we can be ourselves. Those are the 3, and then the bonus, most commonly misunderstood concepts in Jungian psychoanalysis. So let's get right into it. Timestamps here. The idea that we can see the collective unconscious or somehow interact with the collective unconscious is entirely misleading, right? The collective unconscious, according to Carl Jung, is a structuring factor. It structures all of reality and inner and outer reality, or let's say it structures all of reality, inner and outer reality, qua the intersection of these 2 realities, or their unity in one, let's say. But the idea that we can directly see or interact with this collective unconscious suggests that there's any sort of essence to it. So this is often, underpinned by the ideas that, oh yeah, well, this story is so archetypal. This symbol is such a deep, collective archetypal symbol. And it must be, I have to make very clear that just because something is an archetypal content doesn't mean that it is an archetype. An archetype has no content whatsoever, in fact, neither does the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is merely a sort of structuring factor in regards to the subject in its intersection with reality, also then of reality itself. So the collective unconscious, it first and foremost has no content, right? We can see its effects, observe its effects perhaps, but that is about it. And again, even in dreams, right? People say, well, I had this really archetypal dream and this was I was so in touch with this collective. You may have had a dream in which archetypal content, you may have had a dream in which you then after the fact interpreted to some archetypal content to have arisen, but this does not mean that your dream, first of all, was archetypal. It does not mean that your dream or that you were in touch with the collective. First of all, the collective always is, no matter if you want to be with it or if you don't want to be with it, it always is. It always structures who you are and what you do. And you may be able to observe its effects, right? You may be able to see, oh, well, I just reacted in this particular manner. This was because the sort of the that which we call the anima has been triggered within me, but the anima has no reality within the collective unconscious. It would be absurd. The anima is a word, a term around which we have clustered certain, let's say, images or certain myths, but the anima in itself isn't real, right? There's no reality. There's no the anima per se. Okay, so that's the first. The second, the self can be realized. The self is a very it's probably the most popular concept in Jung. It's the self, very briefly, is the objective core of the psyche as opposed to the ego, which is the subjective core of the psyche. Now, because this opposition exists, because we say ego and self are in some kind of relation, in this particular relation, the self being the core of the ego complex, we think that the self is something we can simply realize or simply be at some point. Now, think about it, right? The self, the most famous example of an individuation process being the process by which we realize the self, is the alchemical process of transmutation. So the process of the alchemists producing gold. Now, ask yourself, has this ever worked out? The answer is no. No alchemist has ever produced gold. Why? Because the goal isn't to produce gold. The goal is precisely to be found in this process, this constant process of grinding down or carving a stone into something that is entirely enigmatic. Like, we do not know what the self is. And I like to think of this process of realizing the self as a sort of drive, which is it's a very particular way to think about the process of realizing the self, I guess, but it's sort of this impossible desire to sort of for wholeness, which we can never realize, and now comes the reason why, precisely because we are thinking egos. And this is also the reason, by the way, why we can't see the collective unconscious. As I said, the collective unconscious is everything. It's everywhere, it's always there. We can see its effects, but we can always only see its effects on the ego because we can always only see anything from the perspective of the ego. The ego is the way it is. And now some people may say, well, what about psychedelic experiences when the ego breaks down? Well, sure, the ego breaks down momentarily, hypothetically, but then if you look back and reflect on it, again, you're reflecting through the ego. Because if you couldn't reflect if it wasn't through the ego, there's no way to reflect if not qua ego, right? That's your precise reflective component. And the reason why the self can't be realized is because it's always, the realization of the self would always be at the expense of the ego. And this would mean that you'd be dead, or be a child, properly speaking. Like Jung says, we have to become children again, and I think Jesus says the same thing in the Bible. And the point is, you have to become children again, not you just have to become a child, because that essentially means you have to entirely remove yourself from language and any sort of ego-related components of reality. But you have to attempt to live like that within the confines of the ego. And this is also the reason why for Jung, the individuation process is two phases. One, realizing or developing a strong ego. Two, attempting to dismember that ego slowly and allow the ego to build a relationship with the self. But you can never realize the self. The self, there's nothing to realize. So finally, we can, the proposition that we can control reality. And by that I mean the proposition that we can control our own destiny. Now, from the first two common misunderstandings that I've elaborated on, you may already be aware why this doesn't work, right? You have the collective unconscious as a factor that structures reality, that gives trajectories to reality, and you have the self as this sort of objective core of the psyche that always attempts to realize itself. It always forces the ego to realize itself at the expense of the ego. The ego and the self are involved in this constant struggle. The ego attempting to maintain its sort of its stability and permanence and projectability, and the self going like, well, this is wrong and this is wrong, you should be this, and always calling things into question, always a rupturing. I call it a rupturing process. Based on these two presumptions, you're already aware that there's no way you can control reality, right? But there are a lot of other sort of things to say about this, because if the collective unconscious is the underlying reality or the underlying factor of physical and psychic reality qua the interaction of the two, then there are a whole number or a whole range of collective factors that influence the sort of destiny of the unfolding of your psyche. You know, Jung says that, you know, if you look at the individuation, or this is Jacobi speaking, one of Jung's students, if you look at the development of an acorn into a tree, you see that that if the factors are right, if there's sunlight and so on and so forth and space, the tree will grow. There's nothing the tree has to do. There's no struggle involved, right? It's the struggle to make space for the factors to be right, but the tree has no control over these factors. And in the same way, I think we should think about the development of the psyche and the unfolding of the psyche, right? Yes, there are factors that may be in the way of the individuation process of the psyche, but in the end, this individuation process is developing naturally, it's unfolding naturally. And that which is in the way is maybe in the way for a reason. And I think what the first call of Jung is to sort of, for us to witness reality, to sort of see reality as it is and witness our position within it and without it. And now finally, the sort of bonus section, the assumption that we are ourselves, right? This is based on the theory sort of the structure of the ego, or the critique I'm launching at this statement is based on the structure of the ego. So the ego is structured, basically the ego, as I said, is this narrating function, is what we tell ourselves what we are, right? It's this, I am narrating, I am X, Y, Z, and the story that we tell ourselves is a sort of a linear story that is projected into the future, sort of forward moving. Now, the problem is that the ego itself doesn't have content. I've elaborated on this in multiple videos. Please go check them out because I want to make this concise. But essentially, the ego, in order to fill itself with content, goes around the world and about reality, and sort of takes certain elements and subjugates them or integrates them within this linearity, within this narrative. So, for example, it says, "Oh, the dog, right? Oh, dogs are so nice. They're so cute. I love petting dogs, right?" And then it sort of integrates the image of dogs in general, represented by this one dog that it liked petting, or the couple dogs that it liked petting. Now, this does not represent dogs at all, and it doesn't even represent this one dog, because even this one dog has a lot of aspects that the ego didn't integrate, because it always is necessarily concerned with reduction of complexity. Now, the reason why we are not ourselves is because we are made up of these elements. Everything we consider to be true is precisely subject to this process of subjugation. The fact that I think I am healthy and I will always be healthy. Like, what the hell? Like, how can I assume this? You know, the fact that the world will be at peace all the time. How can I assume it? You know, there's so many assumptions we make all the time that are all based on these simplifications of the ego in order to make content projectable into the future, so we can move through the world in a safe manner. Now, these elements, however, that we subjugate nonetheless continue to develop and unfold. And since we consider them to be us, we essentially continue to develop and unfold while the interpretation of the ego stays the same and stable. And this is where you see there's this tension, this conflict that develops on the level of the ego, right? Between these elements that continue to develop and unfold and the ego that has this fixed interpretation. And this is why I would say we are not ourselves. We're always possibly subject to a rupture, to the clash of these two sort of elements of life. Okay, so in conclusion, I would say study Jung. He's very interesting and rewarding to study. It gives us a great perspective on the sort of reality that we interact with, a perspective I think that can be supplemented with the study of psychology, neuroscience, and general psychoanalysis and philosophy, but is certainly very valuable standalone. And again, if you're interested in the videos, do subscribe. The quest of this channel is to make Jungian concepts again, to put them to explicate them and to develop them together. And yeah, do leave a like if you like this video. Thanks for watching.